Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video I'm so excited about because we're going to be chatting through my favorite new fantasy of 2023. That's right, last year I tried to make it a priority to read as many newer fantasy releases as I could to make sure I was able to recommend to you guys my personal favorites and the ones I think are worth starting or picking up, especially as a lot of new series are coming out on the scene. But before we dive into the books themselves, first a word from this video's sponsor, which is Monopoly Go. Listen, it's winter, it's cold, it's dreary, it's currently 15 degrees outside of my window as we speak, and there is nothing I would rather be doing than going on a beautiful, all-inclusive resort vacation. Unfortunately, that's not in the cards for me, literally. But luckily, I can turn to Monopoly Go and live my vacation dreams virtually through this super fun phone app. Monopoly Go utilizes the gameplay we all know and love growing up with the board game, but brings it to a mobile app experience, which is so much fun. Escape to this reimagined world of Monopoly, hit go, collect cards, collect all the Monopoly money you can think of, play with your friends and family and other fellow Tycoon members online, and overall just create your Monopoly empire. I love that the game itself has really stayed true to the classic Monopoly visuals, but everything has sort of been tailored and reimagined for a digital phone experience, which I think is great. And you're still enjoying the primary mechanics of the game. You're collecting properties, building houses and hotels, and especially with sort of a travel mindset, you can kind of create these hotels of your dreams. Another really cool feature about this digital Monopoly Go is that so many of the boards are actually modeled after your favorite cities. You can escape to New York or London or whatever destination you are dreaming about, especially again with this terrible weather. But don't worry, you can travel to these beautiful locations via Monopoly Go, either with solo or group play. So again, you can play with your friends, but you can also play by yourself. And there's also something called cozy sessions, which are more truncated sessions of games lasting about 5 to 15 minutes. So it's really easy to kind of fit in various games of Monopoly throughout your day, which is an absolute blast. If you guys are interested in checking out Monopoly Go as a perfect wintertime destination, I'll have a visual of a QR code that you can scan to download the app, as well as a link down below in my description if you want to learn more. Thank you again to Monopoly Go for sponsoring this video. I've loved Monopoly my whole life, and now I can challenge and defeat my brother even though he lives on the opposite coast of me, which is spectacular. But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive back into the book recommendations. As I mentioned, I read quite a few fantasy books last year, and I've narrowed that down to 9 of my favorite newer releases of last year. Some of them are sequels, but the majority of them are either standalones or first books in a series, so let's just go ahead and dive right in. The first book I'm going to mention is literally everywhere, and it is everywhere for a reason, and that is The Will of the Many by James Islington. This is an absolute blockbuster of a fantasy release. It's a first book to a new series, and it absolutely knocked my socks off. I flew through this book. I could not put it down. It's plot forward, rooted with a very likable character. It's kind of coming of age. It also centers a military academy school setting, and it honestly just has everything you could possibly want, especially if you want like an action forward fantasy series. But what is this book about? This series is set in a Roman-inspired fantasy world wherein which we're introduced to our main character, Viz. In this world, magic is organized within a literal hierarchy. Basically, everyone gives over their physical will to the empire, and the higher you are on this hierarchy, the more will you're able to harness, meaning you have more power than like the average person. Viz is a part of this empire because his kingdom was basically taken over, and he is trying to do everything he can to prevent his will from being taken. Unfortunately for him, he sort of catches the eye of a powerful individual from one of the factions of this government, and he's basically recruited to be a spy for them at this military academy. Unfortunately though, basically right when he begins his training to enter this academy, he's also pulled into another fold of other powerful individuals who also want him to give them information. Basically, Viz is at the center of a very precarious balancing act. Alongside that, we also see Viz as he has to take on classes and various challenges, make friends, protect himself from enemies. This is a truly unputdownable book. It's breakneck. It's so entertaining. Viz is great. The side characters are great. Magic is interesting. The world is interesting. I can't wait for book 2, which I do believe comes out this year or very, very soon. I highly recommend checking this out if you haven't already. The next book I have to recommend is another first book to a series, and that is The Book That Wouldn't Burn by Mark Lawrence. This was actually my first Mark Lawrence book, and I definitely want to check out his backlog because I enjoyed this so much. His writing style was so beautiful and lyrical. I hate to say I was kind of surprised by that, but I was. This book centers a never-ending magical library that's massive. Like, the vibes of this library are so mysterious and so magical, and if that in any way calls out to you, I feel like Mark Lawrence really crafted a fantastic setting for the story to take place in. This is a very mysterious book, meaning as you're reading it, a large part of the experience of reading this book is just trying to piece together what in the world is going on. But this story also centers our two main characters, a young woman and a young man, and their fates become intertwined in a very interesting way. The young woman travels from the outskirts of this fantasy world after her community is destroyed by monsters, and she becomes an apprentice to this library, and the young man lives within this library in like a closed off room with his siblings, which he has lived with his entire life, isolated from the world around him. Again, full of so much mystery, so many vibes, lots of interesting twists and turns, and I loved shifting back and forth between the two perspectives of these characters. I really liked where Mark Lawrence was going with this story, and I can't wait to pick up book 2, which also comes out this year. Next up, I have Swordcatcher by Cassandra Clare. This book is a blast. If you're looking for a fantasy book that has great romantic angst and tension, but isn't romantasy because it also has a fantastic like fantasy setting, and the romance isn't like the heart of the story, but you still want like a good, intriguing, and a little bit steamy like romantic subplot that's super drawn out, this is going to be that series. Book 1 absolutely drew me in. I flew through this book. I was so entertained. Like the politics, the world building, the character development in this was top notch, but the hints of the possible romantic entanglements also destroyed me. I was hooked into this book on so many different angles. I was also kind of surprised with how much I loved this. Looking back, I shouldn't have been, but it really was just so entertaining. But this is a dual perspective fantasy story set in a city-state like political setting. Here, the kingdom is really rich, really powerful, but it's more so powerful not because of its like landed military, but instead its trading connections, and the aristocrats of this land also have a lot of power due to their various like trade connections as well, making the political landscape very, very complicated. In this book, we're reading from two main characters. The first is Kel, and he is something called a sword catcher. Basically, taken as an orphan, he was trained to not only be able to impersonate the crown prince, ultimately, if needed, die for the crown prince. And we follow Kel in his complicated relationship with the prince, and also he's very much like involved and surrounded by all the politics of the kingdom too, just given the nature of his position. The other main character we follow is Lynn, and she is a healer by trade. She's also a part of a cultural group that is very ostracized across this entire fantasy world, and that is because her cultural group is the only individuals who still have access to magic, which has since been vanished from this fantasy world. Due to this, Lynn and her people have to live by an entirely different set of laws. They have to live separately from everyone else. They have to dress differently, and Lynn herself is further ostracized as a woman pursuing a career in medicine and healing. These two characters' paths intersect in a very unexpected fashion, and from there we're introduced to a slew of characters, are involved in so many different political dealings, magic, under the table stuff is happening. It's so good. I was hooked with book 1. I can't wait for book 2. I need more from this series immediately, but I do feel like we're gonna have a little bit of wait because Cassandra Clare is a busy woman, but this is so worth checking out. I was so entertained. The next book I have to recommend came out in January, and the sequel I also want to say comes out this month, if not next month, and I feel like it is criminally underrated. More people need to read it, and that is Empire of Exiles by Aaron M. Evans. This is the first book to what I would describe as a perfect hybrid of like high fantasy and whodunit murder mystery. This is a multi-POV story with, at the very core of it, there's like a conspiracy, there's murders, there's so many different things happening, and there's so many different mysteries to uncover. This book is set in a fantasy world where basically there's this very large and powerful walled fantasy city, and due to the events of things happening outside of the city, a lot of different groups of individuals in this fantasy landscape have come to move here and all reside together for their own survival. Due to this, there's lots of different cultures, there's lots of different powerful players kind of vying for control of this city. Also, before the start of this novel, there is an attempt of an overthrow of the government, but this sort of mini rebellion was dealt with swiftly, or at least everyone thought. But when murders begin to rock the city once again, it seems to possibly tie back to this rebellion conspiracy. From there, we're introduced to our four main characters. One is a detective character, makes sense. We also follow a novice within the archives, which sort of centers the magic system. We follow like her supervisor, and then also a young man hired to be a liaison between the archive and like a bunch of lawyers in this world. It balloons so quickly, the conspiracy, all of these characters working together, trying to survive and to unpack the political nature of this world was just addicting. I love when thrillers are combined with a fantasy landscape and setting. I find it so entertaining, and this was one of my favorite versions of that I have read in a long time. And again, more people need to check it out and read it because it was so good. Next up, I have two sequels I quickly want to just give a shout out to that did come out last year. The first is He Who Drowned the World by Shelley Parker Chan. I loved this book. I loved this duology. It was so excellent. It is a historical fantasy story centering so many dynamic characters, their journey, the power struggle of this book. Everything about it was so well done. Shelley Parker Chan had me on the edge of my seat and absolutely horrified, terrified, heartbroken for everything that was also happening over the course of the series. I feel like as the final novel within a duology, the author did a fantastic job wrapping everything up and also really exploring the complexities of the world that she created. But this is a story set in 15th century China and basically follows the overthrow of the Yuan Emperor and the rise of the new emperor and the new dynasty in China. This series does have a dash of magic, which is really interesting to explore and I feel like wraps super well within the historical narrative. But we follow a variety of characters, and throughout the narrative itself, like gender, identity, and belonging are a huge part of the story and a big part of the plot. Our main character is named Zhu, and she basically takes on the identity of her older brother after her family perishes, and from there she kind of gains education and also gets involved in rebellion, and you see her working up through the ranks. But we're also introduced to a variety of other characters across the land, all wanting power for various reasons. This series is so complex, it's very dark, and really combines elements of action, court politics, and really interesting character studies too. So good. Masterclass in writing. I loved it. Another sequel that was so good, even better than the first one, and the third and final book comes out in February, which I cannot wait for. That book is The Tyranny of Faith by Richard Swan. This is the second book to the Empire of Wolf series, one of my current new favorite fantasy obsessions. There is no sophomore slump here. This book was so good. I became even more obsessed with this world. There was like an unexpected romantic element that I was not even aware that I needed, but came completely obsessed with when it appeared. But this series is set in a fantasy world where the Empire is able to rule and sort of keep the law of the land going through individuals called justices. They basically roam the land and can act as the Emperor's judge and executioner of various crimes. They also have a variety of different magical powers, but they're also bureaucrats and are very much connected to the government. In the first book, we're introduced to a character named Sir Conrad van Valt, who is one of the most powerful justices in the land, but this book is not told from his point of view, no, but instead his female apprentice, and she's writing the book reflectively, meaning that like as a narrator, she already knows everything that's going to happen, so she's sort of recounting everything to us, and that hindsight is added as a flourish to the narrative quality, which I loved. Book one is really about introducing us to the characters, introducing us to the possibility of a conspiracy as they're investigating a crime of aristocratic corruption. Book two is cracking everything open. We're aware of various power players and people are starting to make their moves, and it is so intense. I could not put this book down. I also really loved the change of setting and just all the growth that the author did within book two was so well done. I can't wait for book three. I have really high expectations. I hope I love it as much as this installment, but Tyranny of Faith was so good. The next book I have to recommend is The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshni Chokshi. This was by far one of the most beautiful fantasy books I read last year. If you love lyrical, flowery writing, especially books that center like folklore and myth, you have to read the story. It felt like a modern founding myth that Roshni created. It was just stunning and dark and complex, and I ate up every single word, every single page. It was beautiful. But this story introduces us to our main character, the bridegroom, who marries this beautiful, mysterious woman, and this woman agrees to marry him as long as he never looks into her past and never asks any questions about her family. He readily agrees because he falls in love. Initially, their marriage is great. She's kind of mysterious and violent, but everything's going great until one day she receives a letter from her estranged family telling her that her aunt is sick. So they travel back to her family home and the past begins to reveal itself, told in the present from the bridegroom's point of view. But we also read from the past from our main character's old best friend's point of view, and we see how these narratives interact and intertwine. It's so lush, like the stylization, the setting, the emotion, the intensity of it, I loved. Again, if you love like myth, folklore, anything like that, especially with really interesting, complex characters at the heart of it, you have to check this out. Roshni's writing was a delight, an absolute feast, if you will. The next book I absolutely loved last year, and I hope there's like 30 books within this series because I feel like it could just be like a serialized epic, if you know what I mean. That book is The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi by S.A. Chakraborty by Shannon Chakraborty. This is a first book to a new series by this author, and it's another like historical fantasy influenced book. It's also swashbuckling and full of fun. In it, we're introduced to our main character, Amina al-Sirafi, and she is a notorious pirate. And she's also retired. She has countless stories of her past. She's feared all of these things, but she's not really interested in heading back out at all. She wants to stay at home and raise her daughter until one day she's offered something she simply cannot refuse. So we see Amina al-Sirafi bring the band back together, if you will, confront some questions and uncertainties from the past, but also take on new adventures, create new myths and lore around who she is, and basically get back together with her crew to take on whatever comes to her next. I had a blast reading this book. First off, Amina al-Sirafi as a main character, as a pirate, was great. She's funny, she's boisterous, she's also so cool. Like, if you had a character that you wanted to sit down and have a drink with, it's Amina al-Sirafi. Like, she's done so much, and seeing her kind of revisit old haunts and reflect on various stories from her past was great. I love seeing her reconnect with her old crew. It had so many different found family components to it, and it was beautiful. There was also kind of some unfortunate people creep back up from her past. There was different obstacles they had to overcome. It was, again, just a swashbuckling adventure of a good time. If you want a pirate seafaring tale, this is it. I loved it. And the last book I'm going to chat about, or my last favorite new fantasy of 2023, has to be Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson, another kind of adventure seafaring novel, but this is often described by Brandon Sanderson if The Princess Bride was told by Buttercup's point of view, and it's just so delightful and full of so much whimsy and adventure. I had a smile on my face reading this the entire time. There's also a really fun component with the narrator, which ties directly into the Cosmere itself. So if you are a part of the Sanderson world, if you will, this also has some bonus elements that makes the story a lot of fun. But I also feel like this is a perfectly fine place to start with Brandon Sanderson, especially if the narrative sounds interesting to you. But in this story, we follow our main character, Tress, and Tress is really happy with her life. She lives on this isolated island, which technically no one is allowed to leave for some unknown reasons, if you will. She loves her family, she has a love in her life, she's happy, she's content. She doesn't really need or want to go get more than what she has, until one day the love of her life is taken far away and she decides it's up to her to save him. So you see as Tress goes out into the wide world to take on adventure, take on obstacles, and try to save the love of her life. She makes friends along the way, she makes enemies along the way. She also travels with a talking rat companion, which is great. What's also really interesting about this world is that it kind of has vibes that we know and recognize, but it is set on another planet. So instead of setting out on like the sea as we know it, which is full of water, the sea is actually comprised of spores. And in this world, spores can spontaneously combust into creation, making just a magic system and fantastical scenarios that are really interesting to read and explore. Different spores with different colors do different things. It's just really creative and fun. Again, this has humor and heart and whimsy. I was delighted by it, and I highly recommend it. And it has illustrations throughout it that just make the whole thing even better. I love Tress of the Emerald Sea. Alrighty guys, those are my favorite new fantasy releases of 2023. Please let me know down below some books that came out last year that you loved, as I would love to know so much. Again, big shout out to the sponsor of this video, which is Monopoly Go. Again, I'll have a link down below if you're interested in downloading the app, but I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon with another one soon. Goodbye!